Good morning and good day. Welcome to our second session in our mini-series of risk-based financial management and supervision. Our topic today is using actuarial reports, getting the added value. As communicated to our attendees, if you wish to listen to the Spanish or French interpretation, please click on the interpretation icon. When using the app on your phone or tablet, this will appear by using the More button. Then you can select the language of your choice, either English, French, or Spanish. Please note that this feature is only available in a downloaded Zoom client on your PC or Mac, or in your phone or tablet app. This session is being recorded and will be available in all 3 languages within the next few days on our event website. Last week's webinar on ORSA is already available for your viewing pleasure. Now, we encourage you during the webinar to submit your questions using the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we will respond to your questions at the end of the webinar. Please note also that our final webinar in this series will take place next week at the same time, and will focus on the proportionate risk assessment, the IA tool in action. If you've not registered for the other webinar, we encourage you to do so. Now, let's start off the webinar with a few polls. Anne, please. So our first poll, are you an actuary or do you work in the actuarial field? Please answer yes or no. Looks like we have an even split between those. We can go perhaps to the next question. Anne? Do you have experience as an insurance supervisor or regulator? Looks we have a very good proportion of supervisors or regulators in this webinar. Perfect.
Excellent, very good.
So our third question, you can go to the next one, Anne. Sorry, Anne? Oh, okay. Have you ever assessed or contributed to an actuarial report before? Okay, that's good.
Very good, very good.
Yeah. And our last question, what would you like to get out of this session? To learn how to do my job effectively is A, B, to feel more comfortable reading an actuarial report, C, to better understand actuarial reports, D, to learn how to approach an actuary if I have any questions about the report, or E, other. Okay, that's perfect because that's the topic of our session today. You'll get you to understand a little bit more about actuarial reports. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers today, Stuart Wayson and Britta Hay. Britta is a fellow of the Society of Actuaries, and she also holds the risk management credentials, which makes this particular topic right in her heartland. She has 5 years experience working inside a supervisor in the Caribbean, and she's a university teacher as well. So she'll be able to share her insights and help us move forward in this topic. As for Stuart Wayson, he has had a long career in the actual profession, but also in risk management. And for 10 years, he also served for the Canadian supervisor, OSFI. And during that time, he was also a liaison with the International Association of Insurance Supervisors. He's also currently chair of the IA's Insurance Regulation Committee, and I know he's going to share his wisdom and insights to you now. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to Stuart, who will start off the first topic. Here you go, Stuart.
Well, thank you very much, and good day to you all. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thanks for the feedback on the polls that Christian just provided us with. So a good balance of you participating today, and for those of you who don't have that much detailed experience with using actuarial reports, I think the information you'll get today will be helpful when you next look at an actuarial report, and we'll give you the tools to get started. So let's move on to the next slide, please. So the work of actuaries, and this is an introduction to our webinar today. Now, the work of actuaries is very important to the operation of both insurers and retirement schemes. Pardon the use of perhaps that unusual term, schemes, but I use it a couple of times in the slide deck. The focus of our webinar is really on insurers. I have to say that, but yet many of the concepts we're going to talk about, we believe, can be applicable or useful in reviewing retirement schemes as well. So first off, actuaries are very involved in many of the aspects of the work within an insurer or a retirement plan. And I've listed a few of them, but we're going to talk about that in more depth on another slide. The key point is that actuaries are knowledgeable about the assumptions, the risks, and the risk management needed for the sound operation of both insurers and retirement schemes. Next slide. Actuaries are members of a profession, and we must complete rigorous education, qualification, and continuing professional development requirements. We're required to follow applicable standards of practice, codes of professional conduct, and each actuarial association has its own disciplinary processes. So all of this helps to assure the public that actuaries are professionally accountable and to give users confidence that the work they're looking at has been performed appropriately. And this significantly helps supervisors who must review their work. And just before we go on to the next slide, I guess, I had 8 years experience with OSFI, the Canadian Federal Regulator. I was head of the actuarial division, and a significant part of my work was reviewing actuarial reports and trying to play detective on was the work well done or not. So we're going to talk about that throughout the webinar. So actuarial work, of course, involves special skills, expertise, and experience. And all of you may not necessarily have that background, and that's okay for this webinar. We're going to teach you some tricks, but I'm going to help you play detective like the little man on the left. And just feel happy. You don't have to know formulae or math, such as shown on the right-hand side, but actuaries do understand that math in their basic training, and it's necessary to give them the tools in the sound operation of insurers. But be relieved, you don't have to know how to do that stuff, but I'm going to lead you through some of the detective type questions that you can raise. Next slide. So what are the goals for this webinar? First of all, identify the common challenges you face as a supervisor in using actuarial reports. We're going to talk about different types of reports and their purposes. And then describe the practices for more effective use of the work communicated in actuarial reports. We've got 2 case studies. You received one in advance for advanced reading, but Britta's going to talk about another one in the course of her remarks. And the overall goal of our webinar, of course, is to help you become more confident, proactive, and effective in the use of actuarial reports, getting the added value within a risk-based supervision framework. Next slide. So let's set the stage. Just again, if you don't mind, a little more background just about actuarial work in insurers. Insurance supervisors use the work of actuaries in many ways, but a number of actuaries have important relationships with the insurance supervisor. So we'll just go over some of those considerations. Some actuaries are designated by law or regulation to give specific reports or carry out specific roles by the supervisor, appointed actuaries, for example. There are also actuaries who carry out the actuarial function for an insurer. And of course, ICP 8, Insurance Core Principle 8 of the IIS, requires that within its ICP on risk management and internal controls. And supervisors, of course, are interested in other actuaries in the insurer who are responsible for specific works of interest, maybe the chief risk officer, sometimes actuaries, or even the chief financial officer as well. Next slide. Next slide. So this slide, it just captures some of the types of work done by actuaries within insurers. I would want to paint a picture here that actuaries are involved or can be involved in many aspects of the work of an insurer. On this slide, I would point out one specific role that maybe we don't always think about significantly, but it's the role of actuaries with respect to with-profits or participating product design and management. And this is because most of the roles that we're familiar with for actuaries may be in support of the shareholders of the company. In this case, their role is to provide protection support to the PAR policyholders themselves, even though they may be employed by the insurer. Okay, next slide. So actuaries in designated roles, of course, can be salaried employees of the insurer, or they could be retained on a contract basis. Sometimes board approval is required. Appointed actuary, by definition of its term, the board approval is required. A supervisor in a number of cases can have veto power over proposed candidates if they don't have the proper qualifications and experience. Designated roles for actuaries have significant responsibilities and may be subject to additional professional actuarial standards or even regulatory expectations, depending on their jurisdiction. But in the end, designated actuaries have an implicit duty, not only to the supervisor to faithfully execute their designated roles, but if you like, in the case of with-profits or participating actuaries, they also have a duty to those PAR policyholders. Okay, next slide. There are many benefits to the supervisor in having a designated actuary or a named actuary serving as the actuarial function. Things like it's much easier to communicate with an individual who's already pre-designated by the insurer and acceptable to the supervisor. That opens up the entryway to communication. The provision of actuarial reports and opinions in an agreed upon format and frequency for that designated role. And indeed, the designated actuary can be a source of objective information about the insurer's risk and capital management activities. Next slide. So insurance supervisors are very interested in the oversight role that actuaries can play within the second of the traditional 3 lines of defense in enterprise risk management. I mentioned previously the important insurance core principle on risk management and internal controls, number 8. And I reference a couple of quotes directly from ICP 8, and especially the requirement that the insurer have an effective actuarial function. Okay, next slide. Most important is that the actuarial function must be organized and operate within the insurer or the insurance group in a clear, effective, and transparent manner. Now, this can be difficult if you look at the organizational chart, which actually is from NASA. I have to admit it's not from an insurance company, but perhaps for many of you who have looked at organization charts within insurers, you might identify with this very complex diagram. And my point is that sometimes when you look into an organization and you ask the question, who is the actuarial function head? It can be a little trickier than you think at first glance, especially when you have some other designated roles, appointed actuary or chief actuary, those sorts of titles that can confuse the situation as to actually who is the head of the actuarial function. Now, it's incumbent on the insurer to make this easy for you, the supervisor. Okay. Next slide. So insurance supervisors develop and maintain confidence in the work of the actuarial function, and I suggest 3 different ways. Perhaps the first 2 are the most important, but the third one is also vital as well. So first of all, validation of important aspects of the work of the actuarial function. Sometimes this is misinterpreted as being, oh, you mean you want me to calculate or recalculate the reserves or the liabilities of the company. And that's really not the case. What we're seeking here, what I would seek of you, is that you understand sufficiently the key work, and we'll talk about this later, the key work of the actuary, such that you gain confidence that it has been done properly. You should also see evidence of strong professionalism by the work of the actuary themselves. That's very key, and we'll talk about that again coming up. And the last point I raised is effective feedback loops are very important between the supervisor and the profession, standard setters, and hopefully not, but if need be, the disciplinary process within the actuarial profession. And this just gives confidence to you, the supervisor, that everybody's talking, the actuaries that you're dealing with are involved in the standard setting process, etc. So just in conclusion, ICP 8 says a robust actuarial function that is well positioned, resourced, and properly authorized is essential to the proper operation of the insurer. So next slide, and Britta, over to you.
Thank you, Stuart, and good morning to everyone. So I'm going to be talking about actuarial reports and also a little bit about the types of actuarial reports that you might see as a supervisor. So generally speaking, supervisors will look at actuarial reports and find them very difficult to understand. Sometimes they're even hard to read. And one of the complaints that supervisors have is that reports are prepared just to satisfy supervisory requirements. So it's purely for compliance purposes, but not actually written for a supervisory audience. And so sometimes you can fall into the habit of it's just a checklist. Did the actuary provide a report with all of the required items? And so those reports don't always tell you what you need to know. And a supervisor who doesn't have a lot of actuarial experience or knowledge may not know how to ask the actuary for the information that they really need. Next slide. So actuaries have a duty to the users of their reports. And although the ISAPs don't necessarily apply to all actuaries, you'll find that actuaries are governed by an association that they're a member of. And so if they're a full member association of the IAA and they have adopted the ISAPs, then these requirements do apply. If they don't, other requirements that are similar will usually apply through their own association. And one of the most important ones is communication, because actuarial work is complicated. It is difficult to understand, but it's an actuary's responsibility to communicate in such a way that the users of their reports do understand what is being told to them. And so this helps you in that you actually are able to ask an actuary to explain something if you don't understand it. Next slide. So there's also a requirement for the kind of reporting that an actuary does on their work. And so it's not just a result that the actuary should give you. They should also give you a report that gives you enough information for you to understand everything that is being communicated. So it's not just one answer, yes, no. There has to be something to provide enough foundation, enough understanding for you to see what is happening, for another actuary to see whether or not what is being done is correct. And by correct, I don't mean that the actuary is going to rerun the valuation and come up with the same answer, because two actuaries may give slightly different responses in the same situation. But another actuary should be able to see whether or not appropriate actuarial practices were applied. Next slide. So these ISAPs are very useful to a supervisor. Firstly, because the actuary has to explain the work to the supervisor in such a way that they understand. And this is very important to you. Hold on to this. Remind the actuary that, yes, you don't understand what they have told you. The actuary has to explain. So it also means that if you have a strong actuarial function within the supervisor, that your actuarial function can look at the work that was done and get a good understanding of if it was done properly. And in the event that you're a smaller supervisor and you don't have staff that can do that on their own, you actually can get expertise from outside of the supervisor. So sometimes there may be an actuary who has a standing relationship with the supervisor, or it might just be a contract in a very unusual case where you need more help. Next slide. So I'm going to go over 4 purposes of actuarial reports, and these are not all mutually exclusive. So an actuarial report will have some or maybe just one of these purposes. But one of the most important purposes is documentation. And so the work should be able to explain what was done in enough detail for another actuary to understand if it was done reasonably. And so peer review is an important tool, and the documentation that's provided will allow for peer review. Another actuary can check and see if it was done correctly. It's also necessary for risk management. You have to have documentation of what was done. Some reports are for decision-making, and these are not necessarily reports that will go to the supervisor, because a company might be making decisions about what they do within their own business. And so it's not something that needs to be reported externally. But the reports are going to be looking at what are the effects of making this decision? What are the pros and cons? Who are the winners? Who are the losers? And so decision-making reports will be useful to a supervisor, but are not necessarily required reporting. Next slide. So an actuarial opinion, and that is possibly the most public of actuarial reports. And so in this case, the actuary will give their opinion on whether or not, for example, the reserves that an insurance company hold will be appropriate for the outstanding liabilities. So that's adequacy of policyholder obligations. Or in the case of participating in insurance, then you might have a fairness of allocations opinion. And so this is where the actuary is giving a binary yes, no answer, usually. I mean, there is detail behind it, but this is a relatively simple actuarial report that gives a strong opinion on whether or not things are okay. And then explanation of findings, an explanation of results or findings. This is the case where an actuary is giving some supporting information. So this wouldn't be complete documentation of the work that was done, but will explain some of what went into the work that was done. Next slide. So to summarize everything in a table, so documentation is not something that you're going to be going into in great detail as a supervisor. But what it does is it allows you to know that the actuary did the work properly, and that if you see something unusual, you have enough information to dig deeper. So they're very difficult to understand. They're very technical in all of the details, but they are required for a solid actuarial function. The decision-making reports, the ones that come to you, well, it's going to depend on the decision that's being made. And they'll look at different options, pros, cons, and definitely short and long-term views. So the supervisor will be interested in these, but they may not always be reported to the supervisor. If it's an internal decision, it might not be reported. The opinions are very important because they will say whether or not the insurance company is okay. And they'll be standardized, and they will not provide deep explanation, and they will rely a lot upon how professional the actuary is in completing their work. And the explanations, they give a little bit more depth. They give a little bit more understanding into a decision where there are winners and losers. So you're trying to find the balance between who gets more or less of the money that's being allocated, or just an overall balance between the competing objectives of the company, say, and the policyholders. So those are not standard, and those are regulated in terms of content, but not necessarily in terms of the language of the reporting. Next slide. So now we'll talk about some of the types of reports that you'll receive. And these reports are going to cover some or possibly all of the purposes that we've discussed in the previous slides. Next. So valuation of insurance policyholder obligations. That's what you call a valuation report. And these are the ones that will have all of the detail that goes into the calculations. And so the actuary has to employ a lot of complicated assumptions, and the justification for the assumptions are important. Every assumption that the actuary uses has to be explained. There must be a reason why they chose the discount rate that they used, or the method that they used for a general insurance valuation. And so this has to be extensively documented, not only for risk management purposes, for control purposes, but especially for peer review if that's necessary. Next slide. So the opinion on adequacy. Well, this is an actuarial report, and this is what the public cares about. They want to know that the actuary says everything's okay. And so the supervisor is going to be getting this report and be taking a look at whether or not the actuary has put their professional reputation on the line by saying that things are okay. And so these are standardized and clear. They will not provide a lot of explanation or documentation, but they will very often go to a wider audience because they might be included, say, in financial statements. Next. Financial condition reporting. And so that's a particular type of report. And in this case, you're going to be looking at what happens to an insurance company if bad things happen. Now, yes, you might be looking at scenarios that are positive, but generally speaking, a supervisor is going to be more concerned with, will this company be okay if things go wrong? And so you're going to find an FCR in different contexts, and one of them is in the ORSA. And so the actuary is going to be making specific statements about how well the company will fare in these scenarios that they have considered. Next. Scenario testing is part of an FCR, financial condition report. And so scenario testing doesn't have to be something that is prescribed. There don't have to be specific scenarios that the actuary must consider. but it's very useful for supervisors in that if there is a set of prescribed scenarios, the supervisor will know how each of the companies that they supervise will behave if things go badly. And one of the other things is the supervisor can also look at what's going to happen to the industry if things go badly, because you're not going to be concerned only in the individual behavior of the companies, but also in the overall industry and whether or not the insurance providers are going to, as a whole, survive if there is a severe adverse shock to the financial system. Next slide, please. And so fairness opinions, this is where there's a little bit more subtlety in the balance between the company and the policyholders, for example, or the shareholders and the with profits accounts for participating life. And in this case, we're relying on the actuary to be professional in deciding how that balance is going to be struck, whether or not the money is being allocated fairly to the company and to the individual. As a supervisor, you're going to be looking out for the individual very often, because the individual doesn't have as much knowledge about what's going on as the company does, but you still want to make sure that that balance is fairly struck. Next slide. So the actuarial function report, well, this one is a little bit different from most of the other reports, because although it does cover the typical things you expect an actuary to report on, there are two big differences. One is that it is required that this go to the board of the insurance company. Most actuarial reports will be seen by the board of the company, but there's not a requirement for the board to see them. And so this report is going to tell the board not only how well is the company doing the things that it does, because the actuary will say whether or not provisions are adequate, but it's also going to report on the control functions, the corporate governance, and it's going to give the board a very good understanding of how well the actuarial function is doing its job. And so this is a vital part of risk management, and it's vital for the board to understand what the risk management practices of the insurance company are. And so these reports will give you a lot of insight, not only into how well the actuary does their job, but how well the insurer itself sees what the actuary does and understands what the actuary does. Next slide. And so back over to you, Stuart.
Thank you, Britta. And if we could go to the next slide, please. Yes, so what I would like to do in this particular segment is to offer to you a generalized supervisory approach to assessing actuarial reports. And this is all with the goal of helping you to get more value out of what you see, what you're provided with, but in the way of actuarial reports. And so it's to give you some specific tools as to how to dissect what it is that you're receiving. So as you can see on the screen, this is ideally a 7-step process. We don't have enough time to go through all 7 steps, so I'm going to lead you through really just the first 4, but the longest one is actually step 1. So let's just dive into it in the next slide. So it may seem very simple and trivial, but there are many good things you can get out of this identification step when we look at actuarial reports. And here are a number of points that we're going to cover. Next slide. So first up on identification phase of your work as a supervisor is, what is the purpose of this report? Well, as Britta was just going through, there could be a number of fundamental purposes of actuarial reports. It's important to get that distinction because it will help you to ask the next questions and understand what the report promises to communicate to its end user. So let's go on to the next slide. Author and audience. For many actuarial reports, the author and the intended audience will be clearly stated. Clarification of the author and audience may be necessary if the actuarial work is of importance to the supervisor, but the chain of communication is unclear or not specified. An example of that might be an internal piece of actuarial work within the insurer that exposes or talks about a key risk. You might be, as a supervisor, you'd want to know, oh, that's interesting, but who actually learned of it? Was it discussed at a higher level within the company? What decisions were made, etc. So that's what this topic is all about. So next slide. Scope and reliance. It's, of course, when you read any report on actuarial work, the author should be clear about the scope of the work. Its breadth, who was involved, and was the work relied upon or used by others to make decisions. So next slide. Key messages, findings, and recommendations. Now, these things may be stated in the report either directly or indirectly. When I say indirectly, that's where you may have to play detective a little bit sometimes. But this finding these messages, findings, recommendations applies primarily to reports prepared for decision-making or to provide an explanation of results or findings. Where this is the case, the supervisor should follow up with the user of the report to determine what action was taken as a result. Now, opinion reports, they provide you with a singular message. The liabilities are adequate, the treatment of policyholders was fair, that sort of a singular message. But it should be supported by other actuarial work and reports that provides insight into the breadth of the analysis considered by the actuary before they rendered their opinion. And that gives you a trigger as the supervisor to look for that backup work. Next slide. Key methods and assumptions. In assessing most types of actuarial reports, it's important that the author identify the key methods and assumptions on which the report is based. But the more important the choice of method or assumption is to the conclusions reached, you should have a higher expectation that those methods and assumptions have been carefully chosen, supported, and documented by the actuary. For example, within life insurance space, a key assumption frequently is the discount rate, the investment return assumption. So that's one example. Methods and assumptions, of course, need to be fit for the intended use of the report. Is it an ongoing valuation? What is it being used for pricing? What's the purpose of the documentation? And more these days, important actuarial work needs to be supplemented by an analysis demonstrating what-if scenarios or sensitivity tests that have been used to show the appropriateness of the selection of the end assumption. Okay, next slide. Connection to governance practices. Governance practices usually subject business decisions to 3 lines of defense. First line, functions that own, manage, and report on risk. Number 2, functions and processes that oversee risks. Thirdly, functions that provide independent assurance, such as external or internal audit, for example. Now, actuaries can effectively contribute in any one of these lines of defense. Next slide. When assessing actuarial reports from one of those 3 lines of defense, the supervisor should identify where possible the connections to the other lines of defense and to control functions such as risk management, the actuarial function, and auditors. So a failing I see sometimes is that the actuary will comment on sensitivity testing, key risks, etc., but provide no link to discussions of risk tolerances, risk limits, the work of the Chief Risk Officer, etc. Okay, next slide. Constraints and caveats. Reports are normally expected to describe any non-material constraints or caveats, but where those things are unexpected, where they're material, where they're too broad, they may render the work unfit for its intended use. Those constraints or caveats can happen anywhere in the work and subsequent report. You need to be alert to wherever you see those listed. And if you find that the actuarial work or reports are unfit for their intended use, further inquiries should be made before relying upon their results. Now, I have to admit to one spectacular example I had where I was called upon as a consulting actuary at one point to provide advice to an appointed actuary in a company that was actually in quite weakened state. And he was asking me to give an independent review of one of his critical assumptions. And I asked him, okay, happy to do that. Who can I talk to within your organization? The appointed actuary said, well, you can only talk to me. You can ask me whatever question you like, but you can only talk to me. And so I did go ahead with the work, but I indicated to the actuary at the very start that I would have a significant caveat at the beginning of my work, indicating that I'd only been able to talk to the appointed actuary and had no chance to independently verify what he'd provided me. So in the end, of course, my report was of limited utility to the actuary, but it was very important for the actuary, me in that case, to provide constraints and caveats on what I've been able to achieve. Okay, next. So let's move on to step 2. So step 2 is now we'll just take a look back on what we found out in step 1, the identification phase. What was unclear? What was unexplained? Did we find big sensitivities? Was the work done in this company out of line with the expectations that we might have had from peer companies? Were there constraints and caveats like the example I had? So you as supervisor should open up a line of questioning with the company, with the actuary, just to resolve those items that were unclear to you. Next slide. Step 3. Now here's the fun part, and I always found this most interesting. Perhaps that's me as an actuary finding it interesting, but I would recommend it to you as a supervisor, even if you don't have a significant actuarial background, as a very useful way to look at actuarial reports. This is where we're trying to assess the performance, the insurer's performance. I think my suggestion to you is we need to play detective now. We need to look at both the contents as well as the performance aspects of the actuarial work that we're seeing. When we look at contents, we're providing an objective focus just on the quantitative elements. If you like, what is it saying about the risks or the risks being studied, the financial strength of the company? These are quantitative things. So now turning to performance, our focus is now more subjective. It's looking at the qualitative elements of the report. Was it well prepared compared to its peers? Did it communicate risks well? Oops. Did it demonstrate good governance and control function practices? So next slide. So this is the type of approach that I'm suggesting. And so the horizontal axis is what are we seeing about the quantitative the qualitative performance of the company. The vertical axis is what are we seeing about the quantitative information coming out of this report. So in the case where the performance is low and it's not giving us much information about the risks of the company, we've got a policeman there saying, stop. There's certainly significant questions to ask of the company. In the two outlying boxes, upper left, bottom right, we've got our detective hats on, and we need to go and check back with the company what's happening there, either with respect to performance or with respect to the risks of the insurer. Next slide. Step 4. Now that we've identified I'll say the risks, and we've clarified those, we've made an assessment of the work that we're seeing from the actuarial report, both the risks of the company, but also the performance of the actuary. So once we've done that, one report, it's true, may not move the needle, as we say, on your overall supervisory assessment of the insurer, but at a minimum, we need to update our supervisory risk assessment of the company, both its risk exposures, risk mitigation techniques, but also we need to update our views on the quality of the risk management, the actuarial function of the insurer. Next slide. So again, whether this particular report moves the needle or not on our overall risk-based supervision of the insurer, the supervisor needs to decide on what messages you're going to communicate back to the actuary and the insurer about the results of your assessment, any remaining issues or concerns you may have about the report, and necessary next steps for the actuary or the insurer to take to improve their work in the future. So next slide. So just as we move on to the case study, which I hope you've all had a chance to read, I hope you make use of that generalized process to help give you insights into what you're looking for in actuarial reports. So the purpose in providing you with Sunny Life is to give you a semi-fictionalized insight into how we might apply that generalized process we just talked about. So next slide. So here are my thoughts about what we saw from Tom Jones, the appointed actuary of Sunny Life. First of all, you, the supervisor, are trying to do is you've identified that there were 3 types of reports regarding the valuation that were available to you. That in and itself is interesting. So you've got more than one way to gain information on the valuation work done by the appointed actuary. One of the reports was a report from the appointed actuary to the board. He reported on the IFRS results. He talked about results of sensitivity testing. That could be very interesting. He pointed out a large decline in the value of the liabilities based on a change in the interest rate assumption, presumably in the traditional business lines. However, there was no narrative about risk management of those sensitivities at all in his work, and no indication that the interest sensitivity results were due to the investment assumption overall or just to bond yields. Next slide. There was another report. Oh no, just sorry, carrying on with the AA report to the board. It also talked about reserve methodology, which is helpful. Discussed reserve movement, that was useful. Talked about significant non-system reserve adjustments. And but it interestingly made no mention of the actuarial standards that the actuary was following in doing his work. Another report was one to the external auditors. And this is very natural in my experience in being an appointed actuary myself a number of times. It's part of the reliance between the work of these two professionals is very good and useful. And I note that the AA gave documentation of experience studies in the setting of valuation assumptions. This could be useful to the supervisors as well. Next slide. There was also a report to the regulator as required by regulation. It was a good summary of assumptions, but I found there was more useful information that was provided to the board and the auditors than went to the supervisor. Interesting. This filing to the regulators also seemed to give a long list of tables of data, which really gave me no insight as an actuary or a supervisor into the risks being faced by Sunny Life. So that may lead to a suggestion back to the companies and perhaps to modify the regulatory filing. And then lastly, the report did give me some insight, which I didn't get from the other reports, about the level of surplus held by the company and the proportion of that surplus, which was related to par business versus non-par business. And it raised some questions for me. Next slide. So frequently what I will do is set up sort of a green light, red light scorecard of my own with respect to actuarial reports that I see. What was good in the reports and what was unfavorable, and then an intermediate category, of course. So there are a number of good things that the actuary talked about. I've listed them in the green column with respect to methodology that he used. On the unfavorable side, there was a significant portion of the assets that were in equities, and the equity yield assumed was 3% dividend yield plus 4.5%, a total of 7.5%, to which a margin of only 50 basis points was applied. That kind of left me wondering. That seemed like quite an optimistic yield going forward. And then the actuary himself did report a significant sensitivity to a yield drop. Okay, so I take that, next slide. So I take that sort of red light, green light image, if you like, and I begin to just make notes for myself. Now I'm playing the role definitely of supervisor here in these slides about the potential material adjustments to the valuation that might be possible. I rank them as medium to high risk, largely related to those equity return assumptions and the interest rate sensitivity. Is there a threat to solvency for this company? Well, maybe. It's a little hard to tell with the facts given in the case study, and it's a little bit out of scope for this case study. But I wonder if there is a sufficiency for the non-par surplus. I note that this jurisdiction that we're profiling does not have risk-based capital requirements, so that makes me a little worried. Is there a concern about policyholder fairness? Well, yeah, there could be. I've ranked it as medium risk because the par block is getting quite small, but the par surplus is significant and it's not yet allocated in the way of dividends or future bonuses to those policyholders. So I'm wondering what's happening there. Is this a buildup of par surplus that will never be granted back to the par policyholders in a fair manner? I use the word tontine. It's a unfair buildup of par surplus. And then lastly, do I have any governance concerns? Well, I've ranked it as medium. It's not clear to me the nature and extent of enterprise risk management given the reports that we've read. And I'm not sure how sensitivity testing or stress scenarios were actually used by the company. So next slide. So now we've played detective, and it's time to ask some questions of the appointed actuary. And I suggest that based on the materials we've received, there are a number of questions that we can ask the appointed actuary. And I would stress, as you look at the questions in front of you on the screen, that it doesn't matter how you open up the dialogue between you and the appointed actuary or the company. It's just important to open up that dialogue. There are no sort of bad questions, if you like, because an actuary who's fully professional and doing a great job will have no hesitation in answering adequately any or all questions that you ask. But some that I have here, just following up on what actuarial standards were followed in the valuation work. I think that's important to understand. It can be an open-ended type question. How are the assumptions used compared to peers in the industry? Perhaps you have already some information on that, but you'd like to hear what the actuary's response is. How was the asset liability matching strategy chosen for traditional life? Anyway, there are a bunch of questions, as you can see there. And as I say, there are no bad questions to go back to the appointed actuary and the company. And they open up a dialogue and help you to understand better not only the risks to which the insurer is subject, but the person or persons you're dealing with in the company. Are they acting professionally? Are they well qualified to deal with the task ahead of them? Okay, so that's the end of Sunny Life case study. Britta, over to you.
Thank you, Stuart. So we'll move right into the next case study, which is a little bit more informal, a little bit smaller. And just to say from the outset that this case study is entirely fictional. I've made it up based on things that I've seen, but there is nothing real about the currency in which the estimates are stated, or about, say, the methods that I'm going to talk about for valuing general insurance liabilities. So in this case study, you are a supervisor, and we have a general insurance company, and the regulations say that estimates of claims liabilities must be calculated using one of the following reserving methods. And there are 4 listed methods. And again, there's no rhyme or reason to why these methods are chosen. Those are just 4 possible methods. Next slide. So in the report, there are some numbers stated and a little bit of commentary on what the actuary has done. And so the 2 methods give 2 very different estimates for the unpaid claims. And the actuary has decided to use an average of those 2 methods as the estimate that they are going to use for the valuation. So this is something that you may come across in real life, because an actuary, especially in general insurance, is going to have to use their judgment to determine which method is going to be more appropriate for that particular report. Next slide. So based on those 2 liability estimates, so the actuary has used the average. Does the actuary's average comply with the regulations? And the regulations say one of the following reserving methods. So A, yes, both methods are accepted, so it's okay to use an average. B, no, the regulations explicitly say one of the methods. Or C, I'm not an actuary, so I'm not sure what the right answer is. Okay, so what's interesting about this is that the real decision about whether or not it complies with the regulations is actually not an actuarial decision. That would be a lawyer's decision, because remember that regulations are laws and actuaries are not there to interpret laws. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so next poll. Would it be appropriate to ask the actuary to amend their report to use just one of the methods? Yes, because it would be in keeping with the regulations. No, because that would be too strict an interpretation of the regulations. Or I'm not an actuary, so I'm not sure which method should be used. Okay, and this is an interesting question, because one of the things that you need to remember as a supervisor is that, yes, everything you do is bound by the regulations. But this is a strict interpretation of the regulations, and regulations are not always correct. And I'm not speaking about whether or not this regulation would be correct, but you have to keep in mind what your overriding objective is. The actuary might have the authority to ask the actuary to amend the report. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's right to amend the report. Next slide, please. Okay, so you have decided that you want one of those figures to be used, the 47 million or the 63 million, because that is strict compliance with the regulations. Who benefits if you ask the actuary to use just one method? The insurance company, the policyholders, the supervisor, or the actuary? Well, it's quite likely that the actuary will benefit because they get to do some more work and possibly charge for it. But the winner or loser is going to depend upon which of those figures is chosen. If you as the regulator are telling the actuary to choose one of those figures, but don't tell them which one to choose, the decision is going to fall then to the actuary to decide which one. And yeah, it's likely that the insurance company is going to benefit because the actuary, being forced by the regulator to choose one, will choose one. But what you as a supervisor would actually be doing in this case is overriding the actuary's professional opinion. If the actuary has decided that this is the correct way to value the liabilities based on what they see is going on in the company, you are overriding that professional opinion. And so that's something that you need to do carefully. So regulations aren't always perfect. And so in the back of your mind, you need to keep your objective always there. Think about what you are actually going to do to the company, to the policyholders, if you force the actuary to amend the report. The supervisor needs to look out for policyholders, needs to look out for the people who don't have as much information about what's happening. And in this case, the decision might actually end up forcing the actuary to do something that is more beneficial to the company and less to the policyholders. The right thing to do in this case would be to ask the actuary to justify why they have decided to use the estimate that they used. Now, justification should be provided in the report regardless. An actuary needs to justify why they've done what they've done. But if you don't understand that, if you don't understand and are not comfortable with why they've taken that decision, have a conversation with them. Sit down with them and try to figure out if you are doing the right thing for the companies, the policyholders, and the industry by forcing the use of just one method. Next slide, please. Okay, so you don't need to know how the actuarial calculations were done to make decisions. And in this case, one important thing you would need to know is why one of those methods would be a better choice than another one. And if you're not a general insurance actuary, you might not understand that. But you can get some clarification from actuaries, from actuarial associations, to say when one method would be more appropriate than another. And so the first thing you could do in reviewing a report like that is to see whether or not what's happening with the company justifies the use of one of those methods. And so you can have a little list for your preliminary review that tells you what the advantages and disadvantages are of the methods. And in the report, you look to see whether or not the actuary has explained why they use the method and whether or not that actually ties in with the data that they are showing in the remainder of the report. So if the actuary hasn't explained why they've done it, you should ask them to explain. Justification is required. It's a reporting requirement. But also, if they are unwilling to explain why they've used the numbers they've used, that's a red flag. If they are unwilling, or worse yet, if they are unable, then you should definitely have concerns about that report. Next slide. So you don't need to be an actuary to have a meaningful understanding of what's happening in an actuarial report. Now, obviously, the more actuarial knowledge you have, the better, but you can still use common sense approaches to looking at the information in the report. And also know where the limits of your knowledge are. If you have reached a point where you honestly don't understand what the calculations are saying, have ways to seek assistance. It's very easy for supervisors to hide behind the regulations and say, okay, well, it meets the requirements of the regulations, and so I've done my job. But no, your overall job is really to make sure that the company is being run well and that the policyholders are being protected. And if you hide behind the fact that you've gone through a checklist and the company has met all the requirements as on the checklist, then you're not fully doing your job. Valuation reports are complicated, but you can have little, what I call cheat sheets that will help you. For example, which methods will be used under which circumstances, and that can help you immediately when you're going through a valuation report. Next slide. And this is partly coming from my own experience here in Jamaica. And very often the legislation can be more complicated than is necessary. Now, I'm not saying that the Jamaican regulations are inappropriate and unnecessarily complicated, but there were times when the legislation, it became clear that the legislation was prepared in another country and tailored to Jamaica, and that it doesn't always quite fit. And so sometimes the requirements might end up being more complicated than the industry is really able to provide. Jamaican insurance companies usually don't have an actuary on staff, which means that the reports that are submitted to the supervisor are prepared by somebody who's not resident in Jamaica and doesn't work full-time for the company. And so if you have reports that are done purely for regulatory requirements, it's common that the supervisor is too small to understand this information in any depth, and also that the companies themselves are not using the information that they get from the reports. If reports aren't understood by the company, they can't advise the company's decisions. And if they're not understood by the supervisor, then they're not going to contribute to supervisory decisions. And the work you do should be advising whether or not you're going to take action. Is this company okay? Do we need to step in? Do we need to look a little bit deeper into what the company is doing? All of your activities should be advising your decisions. Next slide. So actuaries do have that professional responsibility to report in a way that's appropriate for their audience. And so when the actuary says something you don't understand, you have every right to ask them to explain it. Now, you shouldn't be challenging the actuary's opinion. You shouldn't be, as, for example, a non-actuary, telling the actuary that they're wrong. But if you think something's wrong, request clarification. The willingness of the actuary to answer your questions is a very strong indicator for you. If they are unwilling to give you information, or worse yet, they're unable to explain in language that you can understand, then you probably should have some concerns. Next slide. So be careful about following the letter of the law and not just the intent of the law. Legislation is never perfect. You want to strike that balance between what the rules say in the law and what the principles are, what you're trying to achieve. A really savvy, a shrewd company can take on a lot of risk and still meet regulatory requirements. Next slide. So make sure you know what your objective is. Who are your stakeholders? What are you trying to achieve? Who are you trying to protect? And what should you do if something looks wrong? A lot of supervisors are afraid of things that look wrong because they're afraid of making a decision and having to take responsibility for that decision. So your decisions need to be advised by the work you do. Don't be afraid of taking decisions, but the work you do has to advise your decisions. Next slide. Maintain relationships with the industry and with actuaries. So have open communication with the insurance companies, with the actuaries, join the associations, get to know the people. If you can talk to them one-on-one, then you're much more likely to get the information when you request it. Next slide. So the things I want you to take away from this are that you don't need to be an actuary. Know what you understand, know the limits of your knowledge, and use common sense. Ask for help if you need it. Use little tools that can help you figure out what's going on with a company. Just looking at numbers year on year can give you a lot of insight into what's happening and can be a red flag if something is out of line. And if you're in a position where you can draft legislation, think about how effective it will be. Complicated legislation looks good, but doesn't always meet a supervisory objective. The work you do has to translate into making decisions. So make it easy for the legislation to translate into useful decisions. Next slide. All right, so now we're back at the Q&A. Turn it over to you, Christian.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go to the Q&A. I know, Britta, you started typing this one out, but maybe we can take it on live. So can a single report address all of the purposes you discussed?
Okay, it could, but it's very unlikely. Because, for example, if a company has decision-making reports, and so this is something that would be internal, and the company is trying to decide what it's going to do with its business, if it's going to go into a new line of business, or maybe even say merger and acquisition discussions. So it might have a lot of detail in it. It might require valuations or fairness considerations, but it's not going to be required to meet the same documentation requirements as an external report would. So possible, but unlikely.
Okay. I'm going to ask my colleague Pascal if she can come on. We'll do a few questions that have come in French.
Thanks, Christian. We have our first question from Diane. What is the boundary or the distinction between the actuarial function and the risk management function?
Yes, well, let me take a crack at that one. The actuarial function, in my view, is really someone or some persons collectively within an insurer who control and understand how actuarial methods and processes are used throughout the company. We commented earlier in our presentation that actuaries are involved in many types of work within an insurer, whether it be pricing, maybe even claims management, investments, valuation, etc. And all those aspects get interconnected, if you like, in preparing a valuation report and providing an opinion back to the board of directors. So there's obvious connection with risk management and the chief risk officer, but the focus is a bit different. The focus for the actuarial function is that all those actuarial processes are working properly and are well tied together. Hope that helps.
Pascal, do you want to take the next one from Antonio?
Yes. Are the actuarial reports provided to the supervisor with the insurer's financial statements enclosed, or is that provided separately?
Hey, can I just maybe leap in, Britta, on this one as well? It depends.
Right.
The regulator may require that certain reports be provided on an annual basis as part of the year-end filing. So yes, we're referring to some of those in our presentation today, but from Britta and I, we're referring to the wider field of actuarial reports that exist within an insurer, perhaps reports up to the board by the appointed actuary or any actuary in the firm reporting on key risks and these are internal reports that the supervisor may come across doing their desk or their on-site reviews of an insurer. So it could be any one of those.
Yes, and from my experience, there are reports like, say, the financial reports that are not required to be submitted to the supervisor, but they are submitted to other entities, and so the supervisor has access to them and is aware of them. And as a supervisor, you should be pulling information that will support the reports that you do have to look at.
Thank you. And maybe the next one, Pascal?
Yes, thank you. On what basis can the supervisor contradict or refuse the actuary's report?
That will depend entirely upon the regulations of the jurisdiction in which the report is submitted. So the law may explicitly allow the actuary to say this report does not meet regulatory requirements, in which case they would send it back. But there may be cases where the actuary hasn't explained something sufficiently. And so it wouldn't be a formal correction to the report, but the supervisor can always ask the actuary to provide more information.
Okay, let's go to the next one. So what defines the choice of mortality tables to be used?
Yeah, well, mortality tables always need to be appropriate to the circumstances of the liabilities being valued. So if the actuary was involved with a very large insurer writing millions of lives, then it is quite possible that the actuary then has access to many years of mortality experience from his own company's experience. Now that would be great, because maybe then the mortality assumption could be based solely on that experience if it is credible enough, and credible being a statistical determination. On the other hand, if it's a smaller insurer, then that's just getting started, or even in a smaller market, it's a little more challenging for the actuary in that circumstance, because he or she likely does not have access to fully credible internal company experience. In that case, they will have to rely on perhaps industry tables that may be available in their jurisdiction, or another jurisdiction, large jurisdiction, as a basis. But nevertheless, having done so, there will be a large element of uncertainty as to whether his own company's small experience will match that of another jurisdiction, or more broadly, a table developed for all companies in their country. So it's a good question that you ask. It's a question of the credibility of the experience that you're looking at. And by all means, supervisor can ask questions of the actuary. How did they reach their conclusion as to which table to use?
Yeah, and that's something that definitely applies in Jamaica, because we are far too small to have our own mortality tables. And so what the insurance companies locally do is they will usually use tables from, say, the UK or Canada or the US, and apply a factor that makes it closer to what they actually see in Jamaica. But regardless of what tables they use, you're going to want the actuary to always do their experience studies to look at what actually happened and compare it with what they expected, because that's what the actuary is going to do to see whether or not those assumptions are reasonable.
Okay. Next question, do you have any cheat sheets available?
No, that's the kind of thing where it helps to have a good relationship with your industry, because that's not something where you can go online and just download a valuation checklist cheat sheet. But working through the reports that you receive, look at the kind of information that's required by your jurisdiction, and get some insight from the industry and from actuaries as to how you can interpret that data best. And so the simplest cheat sheet that I talked about was just looking at the general insurance valuation methods and when it would be appropriate to use them. So as you do your own work, you can come up with your own cheat sheets. That's what I used to do.
Yeah, just I would add a comment that knowing the questions to ask, as you've probably already guessed, is a question of experience sometimes, and those with the most experience in the industry in your local market can be helpful in thinking of those wise questions to ask. And so you, if you're a supervisor, can look to others practicing in your market with whom you have a more open rapport and discussion as to the types of questions they ask themselves in doing their work. And that can be helpful to you. Sometimes talking to reinsurers in your market as to what they see in the industry as some of the issues or problems. Again, that's another way of gaining insight into what questions should I ask.
Maybe I'll take another question a little further down that's sort of similar to this is, are there any standard templates which can be used to review a standard actuarial report by supervisory purposes?
Not that I'm aware of. And again,
No.
This is going to vary by jurisdiction, because the requirements of jurisdictions will be different.
No, I'm not aware of any, and indeed that's why we wanted to put on this webinar, because there's a bit of a gap here.
Okay, let's go back to the top. So could an external actuary reject methods M1 and M2, but use a calibrated result by combining the two methods, like M equals 20% times M1 plus 80% times M2? Maybe that's referring to your case study.
Yes, my case study. So that's something that we would actually see in practice. And it's something that you'd have to understand what the lines of business are that are being valued and what has been happening with those lines of business to see whether or not that kind of an averaging would be appropriate. Now, more important than that, though, is what is allowed by your regulations. So you always have to fall back to the letter of the law, but have a little bit of common sense. So this would be something where you can ask the actuary to say, why did they do that? And if their explanation doesn't make sense, then you dig a little bit further. But it could be appropriate. It would entirely depend upon the circumstances.
Yeah, I just want to add in here, I think this particular question and a few other related questions are treading on one of probably the trickiest and most complex subjects of actuarial reports, and that's valuation of liabilities, how best to do that. And I guess personally, I'm an advocate, and here I'm wearing my supervisory hat as well as professional hat. I'm an advocate whereby the method of valuing liabilities is determined significantly on the basis of standards which set principles for excuse me, principles by which the calculation is computed, and that regulations are only in place in order to establish certain minimums or boundaries on some aspects of the valuation that are felt to be important. Perhaps a minimum rate of, or minimum or maximum rate of interest might be one. If regulation over prescribes all the aspects of valuation, then you're probably, well, it might be good for the supervisor in some sense in getting certainty as to calculation. You may be losing out on getting the actuary to be fully involved in, is the liability appropriate to the circumstances and the risks of the insurer, because that's really where the emphasis should be.
Yeah, I agree with that. And all of this hinges on the professionalism of the actuary. And so we're assuming, or I should say, I've been assuming that the actuary is doing what is right for most of this. But keep in mind that as a supervisor, the action you're permitted to take under the regulations doesn't necessarily mean that you should take that action.
I'll go to the next question. Would it be appropriate for an insurer to have an actuarial function without having anyone at the board level with actuarial skills? In that case, what can you do as a supervisor regulator?
Ooh, well, in Jamaica, it's likely that there's no one in the company who is a qualified actuary. And so as the regulator, you then have to try to understand whether or not the external actuary has a strong enough rapport, a strong enough communication with the company for them to fully understand the business and for the company to appreciate the value of the actuarial work that's being done.
Take one that came in chat. How do you treat a situation where the local legislation prescribes a substandard valuation method, yet actual practice requires a more robust method which reflects reality, but regulated entity sides with the suggested by legislation, for example, solvency?
Well, I would expect in those circumstances that the profession and individual actuaries would typically respond by saying, reporting at the end of the year, here is my calculation of the liabilities in accordance with the regulations, but also here is the liability that I believe is necessary to protect the policyholders, and here are the reasons why. Certainly in the jurisdiction I'm familiar with, there was a circumstance a number of years ago where I think it was general insurance actuaries were forced to perform a calculation by regulation, which was inadequate in many of their views. So they had to sign qualified opinions that they'd done the calculations as required, but they actually believed a stronger liability was needed.
Right, and an actuary's responsibility is to their profession as well. And if an actuary presented incorrect liabilities as being correct purely to meet the regulator's requirements, they could put their own qualification in danger. And so you'll usually find that if there is a strong disconnect between the regulations and what an actuary should do, that they will report both and make a qualified statement.
So let's go back to the mortality tables. So what do you expect to see mortality tables for 1986 and 1993 to be used in this century? Referring to the COVID situation.
It's too early to say.
Yeah, it's the shape of those old shape and level of those old mortalities tables certainly needs to be revisited by an actuary before they're used. There's no doubt that the health and well-being of our various jurisdictions has evolved since the dates of those tables. So that would have to be taken into account and make sure that the liability determination was an appropriate one, but had some level of conservatism in it. So I think you would expect some adjustment to be made to those tables before use.
We have a couple more questions. I'll ask Lucas if you can come on and take the Spanish question from Mario, please.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So in case you don't have a corresponding regulatory framework yet, what can you expect from the work of an actuary, and what kind of reports should be prepared?
Well, in that case, the actuary is going to be guided by the professional standards. And so what they will typically do if an actuary is doing work in a jurisdiction without that kind of framework is that they will follow the general structure of what's done in another jurisdiction. But ultimately, they're going to be following the requirements of their professional standards.
All right.
Good answer.
I'll take the other one. I'll try to rephrase it a little bit. How do you practically test for adequacy liability for life insurance traditional products?
Well, there are a number of techniques that could be applied. I would look to the ORSA requirements as one very good way of testing the overall adequacy of life liabilities. ORSA, of course, is now an international requirement. Certainly, it's covered by the IIS in their insurance core principles. It's in use in many jurisdictions, and it's where you stress test the portfolio of assets and liabilities of the company going forward. For a number of years under different scenarios and key risks. That would be one way that you could do it.
Okay. Now, I think we'll take this last question. So what role, and this we may have touched upon it already. So what role and importance does the recalculation and checking of actual calculations by the supervisor have, particularly in a market where not as much reliance can be placed on the actuaries that carry out the work in the industry?
Okay, well, one of the things I would say this hinges on is about how much reliance you can place on the actuaries. So again, professional standards apply, and so there should be a lot of reliance that you can place on the actuaries' work. But in cases like that, the supervisor is not going to recalculate the valuation, but they should have good methods for checking whether or not the calculations were done in an appropriate manner. And for smaller jurisdictions, smaller supervisors, you might then get external help to give you some advice on how to interpret the information that you are receiving.
Yeah, just a few extra points I would add, I guess, from a life insurance perspective. I would expect that the actuary would be using some established software platform for performing the valuation. It's not an easy sort of spreadsheet, worksheet type situation. You need to use established software that's been vetted. And there are a number of good products used worldwide. I mean, if you've got unit link business, then you should make sure you go to a jurisdiction that has a lot of unit link business. North American style guarantee type business, or you need to look to markets that have valuation software for those products. So that's a starting point. That takes a lot of uncertainty out of the supervisor's worry, if you like. The next thing then to focus on is the key assumptions the actuaries used, and how have they actually developed them. A number of your questions earlier about mortality assumption and investment assumption, et cetera, would be key ones to begin focusing on.
Okay. We do have one more question that came into chat that's in Spanish. If Lucas if you can get that one.
Sure. So will the technical notes, if I understand correctly, for life and health be adapted due to changes in mortality and morbidity due to the pandemic?
Oh, yeah, a very current question. In other words, is this is the pandemic a one-shot hit to the? Is it just a one-shot spike in mortality, or is it changing the underlying nature going forward of mortality and morbidity? Very good question. I think the jury is still out on that, but you can be assured that you should be looking to actuaries and the profession for having done studies of that. But I would say those studies would only just be getting started at this stage. It is important to think about. Good question.
Yeah, it's definitely too early to say, because especially with all the new variants coming up, we don't know how effective even vaccination, even if the entire globe could be vaccinated within 2021, we don't know if those vaccinations will be effective against all future variants. So there is still too much information coming in for us to know long term.
Yep.
Okay, well, we'll close this off with that final question. And so I want to thank Stuart and Britta for this great presentation. I also want to thank our interpreters who are helping us along in Spanish and French, and also my colleagues from the A2II for helping us as well in the chat with some of the questions. So Stuart, Britta, any final words before we close it off?
I don't think I have much to say other than that. Keep in mind what your objective is as a supervisor. It's not to make sure that everybody follows the regulations. It's to make sure that the companies are being run right and that the policyholders are being protected. So don't let the letter of the law interfere with your observation of that. Yes, you need to follow the law, but ultimately it's the industry, the companies, and the policyholders that you should care about.
And the extra thing I would just add is don't be afraid to open up a dialogue. If you feel your actuarial skills are not great, that should not lead you to being shy to engage the actuary who provided the actuarial report. You can be a very good detective. And actuaries who are doing their jobs professionally and well will have no hesitation in explaining their work in terms that you can understand.
Okay, so we'll close it off and say thank you to everybody for attending today, and we hope to see you next week at our webinar, our final webinar, focusing on proportionate risk assessment. So have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.